So one of the other topics that if you can't talk about IP, you can't do a venue panel without talking about HDR. That's another one that we've talked about. We've mentioned a few builds. We've mentioned Steve's in Kansas City. We've mentioned Jamie's in Cincinnati. We've alluded to Chris's in Texas with their HDR board. Another one recently was Carl Mandel with Philadelphia Union. They have a new HDR board as well. But this may be kind of a silly question, but have we made significant contributions and progress in the HDR realm? Jeff, you can go first.
Yeah, and SoFi's HDR and Allegiant Stadium's HDR.
Right, how could I forget that?
A lot of places are HDR, right?
I'm a silly goose over here.
Right, I think, yeah, no worries. I think HDR, IP, and all of the sort of alphabet soup that goes into it at times can be just that, right? I think, again, to Brock's point about IP, HDR is one of those things that should I go HDR or not HDR is largely dependent upon how much you want to wade into that pool, right? If you are building a new facility and you can start from scratch with a blank piece of paper, it makes a lot of sense to do that, right? If you're trying to renovate a specific portion of your facility, perhaps your control room and your main video board display, that's also pretty low-hanging fruit. It's more easily accomplishable today than it was even 12 months ago. I think where the issues come into play is where you have clients that then don't want to upgrade all of their television distribution system and all of their monitors and displays throughout the venue and all of the other things that having a true end-to-end HDR workflow can impact. And when you have to start balancing SDR and HDR workflows while auto conversions and some other things in HLG have become better, not having a pure end-to-end complete HDR environment can make it very, very challenging. And again, not as much technically as it is just from an operator perspective, right? I wouldn't want to, it's challenging to have to manage both of those color spaces and all of the things that go along with maintaining both ends of that. So I think today, what we hear, even in new renovations, is if I'm not doing everything, I want to make a system that is HDR capable. And then once I have everything in my chain HDR capable, it's not that difficult to flip the switches to make it all HDR.
Right. Stu, what are you seeing on your end?
So I would say that it's a real easy way to tie yourself in a knot. having just came back from working with Steve Funke on the first 3 game days. But one of the big things that I think is really important for people to consider is their LED vendor. So if we think about the products we use in a production room, everything is ready from a test perspective to view the HDR flavor of your choice. HLG, S-Log3, whatever it may be. If I've got a particular monitor, it understands what I'm sending it fairly innately. But that big display in your outfield or your end zone or at your center hung, it is not the same animal. It is not a broadcast monitor. It is an LED screen, and those light emitting diodes are not automatically scaled to some lookup table or some colorimetry. So it's really forced the LED manufacturers to think about, for lack of a better term, scaling the color space that they're working in and beginning to give the user a bit of handles on that, to say, yes, I am in fact feeding, an ADP 5994 in a BTU 2100 color space, and I expect the display to, in the case of the Cincinnati Reds, I need my red to look red.
Right.
Not slightly red, not kind of red, but red.
Yeah.
And that's a trick. And so I think the LED manufacturers have reacted very flexibly. Certainly at SoFi, the folks at Samsung were ready to provide a user interface to correct color space and adjust lookup tables. Doctronics responded the same way. Kansas City Royals was good. Just, but it's extra choices to make on software interfaces. Certainly, depending on, again, as Jeff just alluded, this idea in the production room is you're trying to make a flat plant. Mm-hmm. We agreed that we're going to go HLG, where either ramping things up onto that. The truck signal coming up in 720p now needs to be 1080p and adjusted from SDR to HLG. And then off of it to the IPTV encoders, we've got to now go to SDR. So then you ask yourself, okay, am I bringing over last year's content? Well, that's an SDR. And I've got to really look at those lookup tables. I've got to look at my colors and my brightnesses. If I'm working with T-Mobile and my color for their specific, advertisement is not dead on what their corporation would like to see, it's some form of odd red magenta out in the outfield, there's going to be hell to pay. Right. So we've got to work those issues out. And quite honestly, in that final commissioning stage, going through all those devices, making sure tables are set up right, that you've got the space to work within what is the true wonderful nature of HDR, which is really getting that whole light scale, being able to see eyebrows and wrinkles and temples underneath baseball caps, and really see the emotion behind the face mask in football. That's what we bought in for, so we've got to bring it to fruition.
Okay, those are a few challenges that the format is still kind of, I guess, dealing with. Brock, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think Jeff and Stu brought up some really good points, especially with the end-to-end workflow, right? And managing your color spaces from end to end. Are you HDR? Are you SDR? Are you down converting to SDR? What can accept what? So designing a flat plan, I think, is extremely important, right? But on top of that, another thing is educating the creative side of the client as well on how they're editing and delivering files, right? And making sure those are in the correct color space, because working on the team side, I know sometimes those edits come in late. Sometimes it's midnight the night before, and you're testing and you're loading things and you're making sure they're working, the day of a game. And if something's out of color space, it's not, you're going back and forth with the editor being like, well, what did you do? Well, what are you doing? You're playing it out wrong, and making sure in the commissioning stage, those things are aligned so there are no surprises, I think is really important, and not something necessarily the system integrator has had to worry a ton about before on the creative file-based delivery side, outside of workflows and coder workflows and central storage. But now actually educating on the color space for the creative side, I think, is extremely important.